Annie Oakley. Told by Keith Carradine. Music by Los Lobos.
I fell in love with Annie the first time I saw her ride into the spotlight. An angel in buckskins on a big spotted horse with a star on her wide-brimmed hat. Chestnut hair flying out behind and 2 6-guns blazing while the cowboy band played Jubilee. May 16th, 1901. I'll not forget that day. It gave me my first taste of the show business. I was but 21, a footloose Oklahoma cowpoke at large in New York City, feeling homesick for the short grass and the sage. Buffalo Bill's Wild West was playing at the old Madison Square Garden, so I paid 4 bits and went in. Annie Oakley always opened the show, right from the day Colonel Cody hired her. He figured with so much gunplay and noise on the program, the audience needed a little reassurance right off the bat. So out he'd send this tiny gal on a great big horse, and she'd commence an astounding display of prowess with the shooting irons. It calmed down women and children to see such a spectacle. I can't vouch the same about the men. Annie'd circle the arena plugging colored glass balls tossed up by her husband, Frank Butler, who was a crack marksman in his own right. No match for little Missy. She'd shoot standing up on her horse's back. She'd hit hen's eggs, champagne corks, Indian head pennies. She'd snuff a candle at 50 paces, sighting backwards through a mirror. She'd turn a set of handsprings, grab a shotgun off the table when she landed, and blast 2 airborne targets with separate barrels firing straight from the hip. She'd do feats of sharpshooting that would make a whole territory full of Boones and Crockett's turn green with envy. It sure put me and my rope tricks to shame. Annie was at the very zenith of her glory that night in New York. She'd traveled all over Europe with Colonel Cody's show, met practically all the crowned heads, even took a pot shot at 1 or 2 of them. There was probably no better known lady in all America. Wherever she and Frank Butler stepped out, crowds would gather. When they walked through the doors at Delmonico's restaurant, the millionaires stood up and cheered her. Companies wanted to paste her likeness on every possible product. Birdshot, cigars, ginger snaps. That pretty little gal come a long way from her humble beginnings. She entered the world as Phoebe Ann Moses in the woods of Darke County, Ohio, the year before the Civil War broke out, 1860. Everybody called her Annie. Western Ohio was still a frontier country, and her people were pioneer farmers. When Annie was but 6 years old, her daddy, Jacob Moses, caught the frostbite riding home through a blizzard in an open wagon and died. With him gone, the family fell onto hard times. There were 8 children in the Moses clan. Annie was number 5, and all but the baby was girls. Each one had to do some part of their daddy's work in order to survive. Annie spent all her days trying to catch wild critters for the supper table, using little traps like Jacob had done. A couple of years passed, and they barely scraped by. All that time, Jacob's old Pennsylvania rifle hung over the fireplace in the kitchen. None of the other girls dared touch it. So one morning, when her ma and the rest were out chopping weeds in the cornfield, Annie snuck off into the woods with Pa's shooting iron. She must have poured a mite too much powder, for the rifle kicked like a mule and broke her nose. But that first shot also brought down a fat partridge. A child don't forget an achievement like that. Well, it finally become clear that they just couldn't make it on the farm, so the family busted apart. The oldest girl married and went off to Cincinnati. Another run over to Indiana. Annie found herself farmed out to an orphanage. By and by, a nice, well-spoken man named Wolf come along looking to hire some help for his wife. The lucky child who went home with him would live in a fine house and wear shoes and go to school half the day. So he said. "Well, I'm your gal," 9-year-old Annie piped right up. Well, now this Wolf fella lived up to his name, and his wife proved to be a snappish breed of she-dog herself, and they cussed and battled from daybreak to moonrise. The fine home he brung Annie to turned out to be a miserable cabin. There wasn't a school around for half a day's ride. At night, they stuck her in a tiny loft with a straw tick so thin that the bedbugs woke up with backaches. It wasn't a helper they wanted, but a slave. Poor Annie endured 2 years of this bondage before she run off barefoot for home. Back in Dark County, she found her mama married to a new husband named Shaw. He was a poor man, but he owned a shotgun and let Annie use it whenever she wanted to, which was every day, because she was happiest out hunting critters. Before long, Annie brung so much game home that she could sell the extras for cash money. And that's how shooting turned into a regular business for Annie Moses. As the years rolled by, there wasn't a boy or a man in Dark County who could outshoot her, and nobody could come close at moving targets, for she was as used to hitting birds on the wing as other folks are to buttering their cornbread. Annie was 15 when she heard that the famous marksman Frank Butler had issued a $100 challenge to anyone who could whup him in a shooting match to be held in Cincinnati. Well, she up and bought a train ticket straight to the Queen City of the Ohio. The contest took place in Fairmount Park. Mr. Butler looked splendid in his fancy buckskins, like a prince of the frontier. Imagine what he thought when his opponent turned up in the person of a teenage girl barely 5 feet tall. And imagine how he felt when the little gal hit 25 clay pigeons to his 24. Why, he was so impressed that 2 years later he swung back through western Ohio and asked Annie to marry him. "Shoot me for a duck if I won't," she said, and they went right to the preacher. Together, Mr. and Mrs. Butler hit the road, putting on shooting exhibitions wherever they could roust up a crowd. Annie mostly played Frank's assistant in the show, tossing up targets, trading shots now and then. Before long, though, it became clear that the crowds liked her better. Men sharpshooters were as common as hoop snakes then, but a female with quick hand and dead eye, now that was a rarity, and worth paying to see. And besides, Annie could just plumb outshoot Frank. Now, Frank Butler was a big-hearted and a practical man, and he loved Annie more than he loved being a show dog. "From now on, you're the star attraction," he told Annie. "But you got to have a stage name all your own, so's your fame can stand by itself." "Well, I'll call myself Oakley," she said. "Annie Oakley." "Well, it's easy on the eardrums," Frank said. "Where's it come from?" "Well, I think we passed at yonder whistle stop," Annie said, pointing out the train window. Well, now, for 8 years, Oakley and Butler toured all around the Midwest doing their shooting act and one-night stands. It was better than plowing a furrow, Frank always said, but at times it was a wearisome, unsettled life. They stayed in one hotel room after another until they all seemed to be the same drabby room. To escape this grind, Oakley and Butler hooked up with the Sells Brothers Circus. It was a big-time, big-top outfit. Clowns, elephants, acrobats, and such. more social company traveling with the circus. The meals were better, and Frank and Annie got to stay in one place for a whole week at a time. They might have stuck with it if the Sells brothers managed to pay a little more regular. In the winter of '84, the show came down to New Orleans to work the Great Cotton Expo, and so, as fate would have it, did a newfangled extravaganza called Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West. Colonel William F. Cody was one of the most outlandish characters that the frontier ever produced. As a smooth-cheeked boy of 14, he rode for the Pony Express, fought bandits up Dakota way, rode with Wild Bill Hickok and General Custer years before Custer's last stand, and got his nickname Buffalo Bill when the Kansas Pacific Railroad hired him to supply fresh meat to its work gangs. Bill had a hand in practically everything that went on in the territories. He was the Wild West, you might say. Then the strangest thing of all happened to Buffalo Bill Cody. He got into the show business. A fella wrote some 10-cent books about his exploits. Next thing, someone hired him to come east and play himself in a theatrical melodrama. Bill was hooked. Playing a frontier hero on stage was a lot safer than getting shot at on the real frontier, and it paid pretty handsome wages, too. Soon he dreamed up the greatest idea of his life. A show that would present the whole pageant of the West, not just in little rosy-hued stage scenes, but in a great big outdoor arena on the grand scale in all its true wildness and color, complete with real Indians, rough-riding scouts, bloody-minded bad men, live buffalo, moose, elk, and lots of gunplay.